The Journey of Square Peg by Diggory Jones. Chapter 5. Event Horizon. 2 years after we bought the boat, within a month of the day that crude oil ran out in Europe, the thin veneer of civility, which had barely been keeping a lid on tensions in our fractured society, finally failed. All hell broke loose. The news coverage broadcasted endless scenes of violence in cities across the world, spreading panic where otherwise the majority had been calm and resolute. From London, an altercation between a petroleum CEO and a House of Commons Select Committee replayed ad nauseum on the hourly news. The civil servant's gaze was piercing as she probed the executive before her. Why, she demanded to know, had the true state of global oil reserves gone unreported by the energy conglomerates? Why were renewable energy technology companies bought up by the fossil fuel giants and their research and development stymied? His answer was dour, matter of fact, lacking any empathy or remorse. I can't claim to speak for everyone, but we, that is, the leaders within our industry, have a legal obligation to our shareholders, said the executive. I guessed he had organised an option too, but backed by huge wealth accumulated through being one of the master technicians of the conspiracy of silence that had kept even our government in the dark up until now. His calm, emotionless reaction drew an angry response from the committee chairman, voicing the frustration of a nation. The leaders of your industry had an obligation to their fellow countrymen and to humanity, she spat indignantly, an obligation to report this situation while there was still enough time and fuel to develop and distribute a viable renewable infrastructure. I guess she was referring to the projections that had quickly surfaced along with the breaking news. It had become apparent that the oil and gas crisis was global in nature. Fuel had become prohibitively expensive for most, rarer and rarer as the weeks passed. There were even reports that ships could no longer put to sea for lack of reliable refueling options, stifling the ability to import food and medical supplies. The executive was seen to shrug before the news cut to a story about a spouses group for British Navy sailors which was campaigning for the government to repatriate stranded loved ones. It wasn't just the ability to project military power that suffered. Without adequate fuel, there was talk of mechanized farming grinding to a halt too. As people fought for what remained, attempts to right the deficit through old-fashioned methods became derailed. Even the farmers were struggling to fend off the assault on their production. Soon, miles of razor wire and clusters of mobile army buildings began to spring up around wind turbines and solar farms. I guess this was meant for supporting the needs of the government command and control, but if no food was produced, not even the army could be fed once their reserves had been consumed. And what then? Would they really still follow orders, or would they use their access to weapons to feed their own families? There could be little doubt. The government would be governing a mere memory. The general population was to be left to its own devices. It would either adapt or die. How had it come to this? Failing to listen to any but their own voices, the politicians had ignored the rise of the far right and of religious extremism, fueled as they were by the stifling of debate caused by the lazy labelling of anyone that questioned the status quo as racists. They had failed to prevent the abandonment of centre ground politics, but making it less responsive to the populations concerned outside of liberal. They had failed to prevent the abandonment of centre ground politics by making it less responsive to the population's concerns outside of a liberal bubble. Just as the stifling of legitimate questions labelled as hate speech left the demands of the disaffected unanswered, so the disconnect of the political elite from the people fueled the problems. A sense of desperation, of public hysteria ensued. And desperate people are dangerous. You can imagine how it felt when gangs murdered the first TV reporter live on air, movie-like images becoming all too real. The shocking scene left the studio anchorwoman speechless, gulping wide-eyed as she watched her colleague die live on the monitors, a glorious Technicolor wake-up call for a population in denial. Amid the screaming and jolting images, as the camera team at first tried to intervene and then ran for their lives, the call to arms of a madman signalled the new epoch. The lunatics had taken over the asylum. It left me with the same "so this is our World War II" feeling I'd had in the minibus on the way home from a temping job in the city as the 9/11 attacks unfolded. It was surreal and yet life-changing. It focused the mind, and surrounded by panic, I was glad to have my solution already prepared, to have been prudent. It was too late for those who weren't ready. As my wife switched off the TV to shield the children from the horror, there were tears in her eyes. "What is happening to us?" she wondered aloud. "Why won't the government intervene?" "I don't think they can do anything," I answered. "They need the military to enact martial law, but there just aren't enough personnel since the budget cuts. I think they'll be working on a sort of nuclear protocol now, bringing key people into shelters until things pan out." "Pan out? What do you mean?" she said, the colour draining from her face. She knew the answer. We'd talked about my hobby a lot as the crisis had developed. She knew that I expected the worst and what I believed this meant for us. She had resisted, at least verbally, much of my insistence that we should be ready to leave our home. She believed that a negative expectation enticed a negative event, so believing things would not get so bad was part of ensuring they didn't. Yet in recent weeks I'd noticed she'd been putting together small packages for us to store, things I'd not thought of: medicines, vegetable and flower seeds, photographs and old letters, sewing kits and so on. It was in her nature to argue every decision, often if she actually agreed, but her actions seemed to show she was hedging her bets. I tried to reassure her, but I was slipping into a new gear, conscious of time. My plan, which I'd slowly drawn and prepared for months already, relied on being ahead of the curve, and there was now no time to lose. And so I began to act on it, beginning with slipping from the house to speak with my elderly neighbours. "Dad," beautiful little Rose called as she ran to the door in my wake. "Can I come too?" "Of course you can," I smiled. Rose lit up as I gave my answer. I returned her innocent gaze. When her request was reasonable, I tried to accommodate her, even if it may be inconvenient to me. You see, drawing on my experience, I was acutely aware of how life has a funny habit of launching bolt from the blue attacks on a person. As much as I could, I brought my children up knowing and showing that I love them, and I am proud of them, because when my time comes to die, I probably won't get the chance to tell them. I never left anything kind or encouraging unsaid to them, and I tried to make them happy. I wish I could say the same of my attitude to Helen. Life is too short to refuse simple pleasures, but a strained relationship colours actions like no other. I had instead wished for an answer to the conundrum, and here was fate delivering it. I forced a smile over the sick feeling in the pit of my stomach. Had I wished for the wrong thing? Had my silent prayer to God I didn't even believe in been heard at all? I had wanted a purpose, a reason to feel alive instead of sleepwalking through the suburban life of a comfortable little Englander, trapped in an unhappy marriage, and now it seemed I was about to get what I asked for. Slipping on her pink and white trainers with the Velcro straps, she refused to learn to tie her shoelaces so far. Rose looked at me for permission to run ahead to the footpath. Her hair bounced in a strawberry blonde storm as she darted down the gravel driveway and headed for our neighbour's house. For now it was safe for her to do this here. There would be no yobs prowling this far from the town centre yet, but according to my theory, it was only a matter of time before such horror as the violence in the cities would spread. I followed behind, wondering how I would broach the subject with my neighbours. I was no clearer on it when I caught up with Rose, just as they started unlocking their front door. The unwanted intrusion of tinnitus I'd endured for several years now began to increase in volume, as it always did when I was stressed. Oblivious, my little one peered expectantly through the dappled door glass, chatting to me happily. She loved our neighbours and was treated like one of their own on her frequent visits to them. She grinned widely in anticipation. Bees buzzed in the lavender by the door. I took in the neatly clipped lawns and tended flower beds of the gardens nearby. Theirs was the best kept of the lot and reflected their happy outlook and energetically positive approach to life, but I could see the strain on their faces as the door opened. A warm welcome ensued. As always, we were beckoned in with great fanfare and followed our hosts to the summer house at the end of their sheltered garden. The scent of roses mingled with the aroma of tomato plants emitting from a tiny greenhouse behind the garage. My daughter settled as if at home, drawing at a low table in the corner of the sunlit room. Rose was absolutely at ease here, in a special haven for her beyond the four walls of her own home. I took a seat in an easy chair and shot the breeze with the lady of the house for a while. I was never quite as comfortable with them as Rose, for I felt sure they must hear the arguments I'd have with Helen, even if they never let on. In a way I was ashamed, knowing how they cared for my daughter. Shortly after sitting, properly brewed tea in small mugs with a plate of biscuits beside them was brought on a tray by the man of the house. With Rose fully engaged in her own little project, we all settled to sip the tea and talk. The sun shot long shadows down the lawn. Small talk turned eventually to the reason for my visit. "You know how things are going in town?" I began. They nodded, commenting about the brazen behaviour of some of the gangs, acting on violent impulses with increasing impunity. "Well," I continued, "I'm afraid that things may never get back to normal. I know the army is under orders to control the mobs, but have you noticed how they don't seem to be patrolling as much as they used to?" I took a sip of tea. There was silent nodding from my correspondents. "I just don't understand how we got to this point," said the old man, a jolly kind of guy, rarely given to melancholy. "What is the world coming to?" "Well, I think it's disgusting," announced his wife passionately. She held her hand to her mouth, hoping to prevent the little girl, who was concentrating hard, from hearing. "Who the hell do they think they are?" Her eyes flashed. "I know," I sighed. "I'm really concerned about things, which is why I wanted to come and talk to you." "Oh?" replied the old man, leaning forward conspiratorially. "How can we help you?" "I wanted to ask you if you've made any plans, if you have any options to get somewhere safe." "What do you mean?" "I think what we're seeing now, the unrest, empty shelves and so on, is the tip of the iceberg. If the oil and gas are gone for good, it will all go to pot. I've no idea what the army has stockpiled, but it can't last forever. So who's going to maintain law and order? I'm afraid we'll be caught up in the trouble without even the basic supplies we need." "We'll be okay. As long as there's food in the cupboard, we'll get by," he placated. "Britain has managed it before, we'll do it again." I really liked them both. They were everything I was not, always positive, a fact that might explain why they looked much younger than their years. Their Dunkirk spirit was the best of British, but the certainties they had lived with before were no longer there. In my view, the enemy was not across the water. There was no escaping it. It may well already surround us. "I think things were different then, though," I replied. A long silence greeted my words as they considered them. A gang of colourful songbirds pecked boisterously at a feeder hanging just outside the summer-house window, the bigger ones chasing off the smallest. The old man turned his palms upwards. "Not so different. During the war there was violence and there were food shortages, but we were okay. Everyone pitched in and we all got by in the end. I think society is stronger than you believe. It just needs a reason to come together. Besides, the fossil fuels might be running out, but there's still all this new technology nowadays. They'll find a way to feed us." He was the epitome of optimism. Faced with his stoicism, I wondered if I was overreacting, if all this might just blow over after all. "I hope you're right, I really do," I sighed, sipping the tea. "But I'm just still concerned that we should prepare for the worst. I don't want to scare you, but I'm not convinced there's enough time to solve this the way you would all like. I mean, to build the new technology and transport it, you need fuel, right? Which is running out fast. Meanwhile, there is unrest. So I'm worried that we've left it too late. And besides, the country isn't as close-knit as it was during the war. We can no longer rely on the British sense of community to pull it through. Social media shows it has already been killed off. I mean, take the divisions caused by the referendum. Reason only rules when there's no cause for conflict. God knows empty shelves in the supermarkets will be a cause of conflict. Whether he was concerned that my ideas were real or the signs of raving paranoia, my neighbour was sensitive enough not to laugh in my face. After all, he'd seen many of the things I was talking about for himself. I suppose many different pictures can be painted with the same palette of colours. I just hoped the old man was beginning to join the dots as I had been for months already. So what can we do about it, he asked, perhaps recognising that I needed to say my piece and willing to at least hear me out. Well, I think we aren't safe here if the unrest spreads. I think you need to make a plan, I answered, adopting as persuasive a tone as I could. You need to be able to get away to somewhere with more space and fewer people. You need to take your family. I mean, do you still have that house in Wales or? No, we don't, I'm afraid. Don't you remember I mentioned we sold it 6 months ago to a friend of my son? And besides, Phil isn't going to leave his business. It's doing very well, you know. He hired another 2 blokes last week. He can't leave just as things are picking up, even if we had somewhere to go. We're happy and safe here, don't worry. But maybe the guy who bought it will let you stay there. He brushed off my pleading look. A hint of impatience began to creep into his voice. Look, I appreciate your concern. I'm glad you came to talk to us, and we love seeing Rose any time, as you know. But don't worry, things will work out for the best. They always do. He tried to change the subject then, telling me about my daughter, doting on her as always. Her head, shining in the slanting sunlight, bobbed and turned as she worked on her project at what seemed to be her very own table and chair in their summer house. He tried to ask her a question, but, like most children, when she was concentrating hard on something she loved, there was no distracting her. Her tongue jutted out as she drew. I used his failure to engage her for one last try. I owed it to them to try. Look, I know it seems far-fetched now. Machiavellian, if you ask me, he winked and smiled. He knew I'd studied politics. Things are moving slowly, so it doesn't seem so bad, but just compare it to 8 years ago, and you can see the direction it's all going in. It's crazy now, I persisted. Imagine how it would be when people are starving. Enough about us now, he replied. Tell us, what are you going to do? You are stuck here too, aren't you? You can't just run off to Wales, can you? What about the kids, school? And won't there be trouble everywhere? If it did come to that, there'd be no getting away from it anywhere. We'd all just have to make do. I have a plan, and if you don't, I'd like to give serious thought to you joining us. The conversation went on, my neighbours listening, nodding respectfully as I explained what we had, tolerating me really. Eventually, his hands went up. It was a clear sign that for them the conversation had run its course. I sensed that it was time to leave before I outstayed my welcome. As we stood up, I managed to extract a promise that they would reconsider overnight. My daughter, having opted to stay a while longer with them, I made my excuses and returned home then. Walking through the side door, I discovered my wife pacing the kitchen restlessly. There were small tears in her eyes. Her face was flushed. Her agitated movements were juxtaposed with nervous smiles that flashed now and then to her lips. What happened? I asked her, perplexed and thinking she had more bad news. She held up a familiar white stick and announced in a shaking voice, I'm pregnant. She half cried, half laughed the news out. Wobbling on my legs, I could sympathise with how she felt. The mix of joy and shock floored me. She asked so many questions, voiced so many doubts in the next few hours, it's hard to recall it all. But eventually we hugged, and I swore it would be good for us, that I was glad that I would never leave her. But, such is life, I did leave the house not long after, running late and rushing to rendezvous with a hire company delivery driver I hoped would still meet me in a small hamlet an hour from home. I had some digging to do. It was more important now than ever before.